the group's website. The link is displayed under the first bullet point on your screens and has also been posted in the Q&A. The idea for these webinars are to build on these Measurement Matters posts, but to actually provide young researchers working in low and middle income countries a platform to talk through how to actually implement these techniques in the field and some of the constraints that we may face when we take them to low and middle income countries. The topic for the webinar today is time and risk preferences. We will begin the session with very brief presentation from our two panelists, who I'll just introduce in a short while. They will introduce the concept of time and risk preferences, and then we will open it up for discussion. So this will be primarily an interactive webinar, unlike some of the other seminars that you may have been attending since the lockdown. So this essentially relies on you participating. So we would encourage you to please post any questions that you may have in the Q&A box. You will then be unmuted and you can ask your question live. Please note with your question, if because of background noise, you do not want to be unmuted, and then we can ask the question on your behalf. Raise hand function is actually disabled, so we would like you all to please post questions in the Q&A box. You're also very welcome to share your own experiences. This is, as I said, an interactive session, so some of the people in the audience may have experience of implementing these techniques in the field, so you're very welcome to jump in and say what your experience has been like. So as I said, we will begin with brief presentations from the two speakers. I'll first introduce the first speaker who will be talking about time preferences, Farah Saeed, who is an assistant professor at the Lahore School of Economics and a research fellow at the Center for Research in Economics and Business in Pakistan. Farah works on topics related to gender and microfinance in Pakistan, where she has run several field experiments, eliciting both time and risk preferences with rural and urban populations. Thank you so much, Farah, for joining us today, and it's over to you. You have 5 minutes. I'll stop sharing the screen so that you can share yours.
Thanks. Thanks, Mahreen, and thanks also to Steph and Samir and everyone who was involved in organizing this while I'm just setting my slides up. So Mahreen, let me know if you can see this.
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about time preferences, and I have a few slides here, and I'm keeping it deliberately brief. So as Mahreen said, we can discuss later, but also I'll try to keep it non-technical because I realize people from different backgrounds are joining us today, but I'm happy to answer any questions later or even offline. So let's start with the basic theory or basic idea behind measuring time preferences. Well, the basic idea is to measure intertemporal preferences, or to answer this question, that how much do individuals value consumption in the future relative to the consumption today? And so I just put these equations up because this is something you might see in a lot of different papers about what do these actually mean. Well, these are two different ways of modeling the utility that you get. For example, we're saying that utility can be a function of what you're receiving today and what you receive in the future, but the things that you receive in the future are less valuable to you today. This could be for multiple reasons. This could be because that's inherently your nature, or perhaps you think the value of that is going to be, in a monetary function is going to be lower. But for whatever reason, we want to know what is the value by which you discount utility in the future. So the first equation that you see here, the exponential utility function, we're saying that this discounting is kind of constant. So we're saying that the discounting is not dependent on where you are in time, but the discounting is how far apart in time are you considering things. So how far apart are you looking at in the future? Is it 1 month from now or 1 week from now? And it doesn't matter if you're thinking about this today or thinking about your future self and then 1 month from then. And in the quasi-hyperbolic function or the hyperbolic function, we have this additional term here where, which we say makes things slightly complicated. So now our discount factor is not just a function of the delay in consumption, but it's also when you're consuming. So for example, I could be very patient today, but when I think about the same thing in the future, I could be impatient, or vice versa. So I could say that I'm very impatient when it comes to deciding something between today and tomorrow. But if I think about something 5 months from now, I don't care between 5 months from now and 5 months plus 1 day from then. So that's slightly complicated than the simple exponential utility we see earlier. And so what we try to do through our different elicitation techniques is to find this discount factor because of which people become indifferent between consuming today and consuming tomorrow. So, depending on the model you're estimating, either you're estimating delta, or in the second one, you're estimating delta plus beta. And so what are the main methods? There are many, but I'm going to be focusing on the ones that we see most often in literature. So the first one is Becker, Decroot, and Marshak, or what's known as BDM. And here we're asking people to self-report the lowest amount they'll be willing to accept today instead of a fixed amount in the future, right? So whatever future you're thinking about, in this example, we have 1 month, but you can change this as you want. And so here you're asking people to self-report. The advantage of this is it doesn't take a lot of time. It also gives you a very precise estimate of the discount factor because you're just considering one situation. But it can also be confusing because, as you can see, this question is kind of abstract. So if you're doing this question with an illiterate sample, they might just be guessing or they might just give you random answers. The second approach, which is a money earlier or later, the MELs, these are the ones that are used most commonly. So according to a very recent literature review, about 60% of empirical papers are using some format of the MELs. The most popular of which is the multiple price list method, where we give people a list of options and we say, which do you prefer, X amount today or Y amount in the future? And that Y amount we progressively increased, and then we check when do people switch from consuming something today to consuming something in the future. And if you want to know at different time frames, you can ask whether it's 1 month from now, or you could say, 6 months from now, what do you think about the 7th month? So it's up to you what you, based on where you want to estimate this. There's another format of this, which is called the randomized binary choice. This is like the MPL, but where in MPL you increase Y in order, in the randomized binary choice, you do this in random order. This is supposed to increase the attention level that participants give, but it can, again, it can lead to some confusion, and it can also lead to some inconsistent choices. So it's rarer to see than the MPL. So the MPL, the disadvantage of MPL actually is that it's less precise than perhaps the BDM. You might end up with a range of discount factors as opposed to one, but it's been seen that this is predicting out of lab behavior quite well. The fact that it's actually quite difficult for us to estimate one discount factor, realistically speaking, perhaps a range isn't a bad thing to get in any case. So I can discuss this more, I think, in the interest of time. I just want to discuss some practical applications as well. So the practical examples of MPL, this is from a survey we conducted in Pakistan. And this was an incentivized survey. So we asked whether they want to receive 5,000 today, 5,000 tomorrow, or 4,500 1 month from tomorrow. And then this amount tomorrow, we keep on increasing. So we go to 5,000, 5,500, 6,000, so forth, and so on. And you'll notice we're not saying today and 1 month from today, we're using tomorrow. That's deliberate because this allows us, this is called a front delay. This allows us to remove both risk and trust considerations. Again, more on that later if there are any questions. And then we ask this on another time frame as well. So we have a near frame where we're considering tomorrow and 1 month from tomorrow. And then we have a far frame where we consider 5 months and 6 months from now. There's an unincentivized measure of this, which has been used by Falk et al. In their global preferences survey. Here they have a list of 25 hypothetical choices. So they're not actually paying like we did, but they asked 25 hypothetical choices, very similar to the ones we had. And they asked early payment today or a delayed payment in 12 months. And they find this validates well to an incentivized measure. So as COVID is something we can't ignore any longer. I mean, in field work, we have to look at things that can allow us to do things on the phone, for example. The unincentivized MPL can work very well in that situation. And so what we do in both MPL, if, for example, we have both the near and the far frame, sometimes people average rows in 2 price lists and find the average switch from preferring early payment to delayed payment. And sometimes it's just a normative judgment. So we just want to know how relatively impatient they are, right? So we don't exactly need the exact discount factor. We just want to know within the sample, is this individual compared to the others more impatient or less impatient? It's also possible for you to find out present biasness. For example, you can establish if individuals are more impatient in the near frame than in the far frame, by just comparing their switching points. So I think, Mahreen, I'll stop here because I do have other slides, but I want to keep that for discussion later.
Great, thank you so much. I would like to now invite our second speaker, Mohammed Meki, who's going to be talking about risk preferences. Mohammed is a lecturer at the Oxford Department for International Development and a fellow at the Center for Islamic Studies. Mohammed is a development economist focusing on evaluating the effects of equity-like contracts on the investment and growth of small firms in low and middle income countries. Mohammed has run field experiments in Kenya, in Bangladesh, and Pakistan, where he has elicited risk preferences, which is what he's going to talk about today. So thank you so much for joining us, Mohammed, and over to you.
Thank you, Mahreen. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the organizers and thank you for the attendees. As Mahreen said, this is more of a conversation starter. I'm by no means an expert in this topic, and there may be people in this audience who are even more of an expert. And as Farah said, with COVID happening, it's a good time to reevaluate some of these methods and which would be the most appropriate method to use in the field at the moment. So risk preferences are clearly an important aspect of many types of decision-making in economics. And heterogeneity in risk preferences could also be quite important in terms of policy and analysis. And there are many such preferences. Farah just mentioned time preferences. You can think of social preferences. There are many things that are important in terms of decision making. And so it's not obvious that you must measure risk preferences, but for some people, risk preferences are important enough for their specific project and their specific research questions that it's worth considering some of the methods that you could use to measure risk preferences. So what's the best method for measuring risk preferences if indeed you want to consider measuring risk preferences? So there's a trade-off between simple measures that are easier for participants to understand and take less time to implement, and more complicated methods that would allow us to estimate risk preferences in a more detailed way and even use theory to estimate specifically a risk preference parameter. And Farah has already touched on some of these issues with regards to time preferences, and it's very similar here with risk preferences. And of course, on top of that, we also now need to consider COVID-19 and the fact that we're limited in terms of the time that we have to spend with participants, and also in terms of the instruments that we can use to actually conduct these exercises. And I think Mahreen has some visuals later to show you some of the tools that people have traditionally used to measure these things. And some of those may not be possible in this current environment. Some may. And so that's why it'll be interesting to hear your opinions as well. I won't discuss the topic of incentivization or not. Farah's already mentioned this. In principle, you could run most of these things that I will mention, both incentivized or unincentivized. So I'll just mention 4 popular methods. There are other methods that can be used, but these are some of the methods that researchers have used and I think are feasible in some of the settings that we work in. So the first one is a survey-based measure. It's a straightforward self-reported question. So it could be a very general question where we just ask people, tell us in general, how much are you willing to take risk? There are other versions of this where it's more specific. It's a domain-specific measure of risk preference elicitation. So you can ask people, how much risk do you take in your financial matters, investments, in your health, in other domains of behavior? And there are many studies that have found a strong correlation with incentivized measures. So this is definitely a tool that's worth considering for many people. The second type of question is, it's more focused on investments and financial decision making. So in this particular case, it's a portfolio choice question. So you give people an endowment, big X, and you offer them the ability to invest a portion of that endowment in a risky investment. And that risky investment could pay a dividend K. So you give them an amount of money and they could either keep it or invest a portion in something that's risky, which can return even more than that amount of money. And so the portion that they choose to invest out of this endowment in the risky choice gives you some sort of measure of their level of risk tolerance. So that's the second method. The third method that I will mention is offering people a choice of rows. So here we have 6 rows in this table. This is made famous by Binswanger and others. And so the individual here just chooses one of the 6 rows. So each of the 6 rows represents an investment which has 2 possible outcomes. And mostly people have a binary outcomes with a probability of 0.5 for each outcome. So there's a low payoff and there's a high payoff, and the probability of each is 0.5. And the individual simply chooses which one they prefer. Do they prefer, say, investment option 1, where the payoff is 28, regardless of whether it's a good state of the world or bad state of the world? Or would you prefer one of the lower down rows where the expected return of the investment increases, but also the variance increases? Now, you can look at their decision. Everyone will choose a number between 1 and 6, and that's a measure that you have straight away of their level of risk tolerance. And you could also use a theoretical model, very simple utility function with one parameter that allows you to estimate their coefficient of risk aversion, or estimate an interval for their coefficient of risk aversion if you wish to do so. And the final method that I will mention is a certainty equivalent task. So essentially here you're offering people a choice between two things. The first thing is just to receive a certain amount of money. So this is like investing in a firm B in this case, which pays you a fixed amount of money, guaranteed profits for this business, there's no risk. Or you can invest in a risky business that either pays a good amount or a bad amount, a low amount or a high amount, with some probability. And so this is usually done as a series of questions where you begin by offering people firm B a certain amount with a very low amount. So say you offer them just 1,000, right? And then you slowly increase the amount that you're offering people for certain. And at some point, they would switch from choosing the risky investment, the risky firm, to choosing the safe firm. And this switching point, or the number of times they choose either one of these options, again, gives you a very simple to use measure of risk tolerance. And so that's it for the 4 methods that I'll mention. There are more sophisticated methods using multiple price lists, very similar to what Farah mentioned for time preferences, and also using Becker de Group Marshak, as Farah also mentioned. So I'll leave that for now, and maybe in the discussion we can talk further.
Great, thank you so much, Mohammed. So essentially this wraps up the first part of the webinar where the 2 panelists have introduced the concept of time and risk preferences, and we're now going to open it up for questions. But before we do that, we're going to do a fun poll. There are over 140 participants right now attending, which we're very grateful for all of you for being here, but we would really like to know where all are you joining us from. So this is an anonymous poll just asking you which continent you're based on right now. This will appear on your screen for about 15 seconds. So if you could respond to it, it would be very nice. It will give us a sense of where you're all from. You should be able to see it now. And it's very nice to see how where everybody is from. Okay, I think the polling is done, right, Samir? So we have about 38% from Africa and 23% from Asia, which is great. Thank you so much for filling out this poll. We have another one, which is about actually risk preferences methods. We were curious to know, just to get you to start thinking about it, what are the top 2 methods that you are likely to use in your own research. So from the 4 methods that Mohammed just talked about, plus any others that you may use. So if you could kindly respond to this as well, it would help to start off the discussion for us. Okay, I think Mohammed and Farah, you can see the poll as well, but about 56% have said survey-based measures, and there is almost a split between offering a single choice and the certainty equivalent one. Not unsurprisingly, much fewer proportion have said MPL, which I think is tricky to do in a low and middle income setting. We have some questions already starting to come in, but maybe we can start with this very issue that often when you're taking these measures to low and middle income settings and with populations who might not have been educated to a very high level, such that they can understand these complex methods, What are some of the techniques that you've used? And here I think we can bring in visual aids as well. And I'm happy to share the slides that you found useful in facilitating subject understanding.
So shall we start in order of which we spoke? Yeah. Okay, so Mahreen, if you could actually share the slides, I think those would be useful. So I do deal with mostly illiterate sample, and by illiterate sample, I mean people who can just read and write. So about, on average, about 50% of them can. This is in a typical, rural area. In urban areas, we have slightly better, but it's still, these are questions people are not familiar with, so they can still get confused. It's important that we make sure that they understand. So some of the techniques we've used, if you could go to the next slide, Mahreen. So the question that I showed you earlier, we use this kind of a calendar with it. And so on this calendar, I'm sorry, you can't see the, I mean, it's in Urdu, so you can't see the numbering, but the numbering is actually on just the dates. And then we have months, January, February, March, April. And so we were kind of pointing out so that you will receive this amount either tomorrow, which is this date, or 1 month from now, you will receive this amount. So just make it visual for them and make them understand what this is. I also want to take the advantage of another paper that was done by Rachel Cassidy in Pakistan. If Mahreen, you can go to the next slide. So here, she's going a step ahead. But this is something that we sometimes face again with illiterate sample, especially women, is that they might, if they're not familiar with or used to dealing with money, the mental maths might make things slower, and so then this might start answering randomly. But you can make things easier by just showing them notes, and so we are able to associate quicker with the color of the note than the denomination of it, and so that helps. So she's showing you in this picture that you can get in April 2016, you can get 500 rupees. Those are the red notes on the left, or you can get 80 rupees, which is those multiple notes on the right. So this is one way of making sure people understand. The second technique that I would say is that we found also with experience is to have practice rounds. So have multiple practice rounds where you're basically telling people, we have to make sure that you understand. So we'll keep on doing this until you answer specific questions correctly, or you are comfortable that you understand this. And I should just mention that more and more reviewers have started to ask for this. So if you're doing this and you do a practice round, people do typically ask, did people understand it? So if you keep on documenting as well, that people are understanding this thing and what is the proportion of them answering this question correctly, that helps later on. And I'll stop here. I think Mohammed might have something more to add.
Yeah, there isn't that much I can add more to the great points that Farah made. Maybe I'll talk just about the fact that some of these investment options that we offer to people, they have probabilities, and people may not be familiar with probabilities, or they may struggle to think of probabilities that are different to 50-50. And so Mahreen, if you go to your 9th slide of your slide deck, here we were trying to illustrate the risky investment option. So red to signify bad outcome and green to signify good outcome. So in the bad outcome, there's a payment of 0. And in the, the business isn't doing well, no sales. And in the good outcome, there's a income of 1,000. So this is the good state of the world. And the probability is 50-50 here, right? And the way that we actually illustrate this would be a bag with 4 balls in it, and 2 balls would be green and 2 balls would be red. And you could actually take the ball out of the bag to show exactly what we mean when we say 50-50. And so if you go to the next slide, if you wanted to start estimating more sophisticated utility functions and going a bit deeper in terms of your estimation of risk preferences, you may want to also vary the probabilities. And so here we varied the probability of a good outcome to be 75%, probability of 0.75. And so again, it was relatively straightforward to do this with just having 3 green balls and 1 red ball. It's an interesting question whether this is still possible to do with a phone survey or some other visual aid. But yeah, that's generally what we've used.
Great, thank you so much. I think we'll start taking questions live now. So first up, there's a question by Omar Baris. So if you could please unmute him. You're now should be unmuted. Samir, I still see Omar muted.
Omar, please go ahead, ask your question if you're able to, otherwise we'll do it for you.
He's still showing up as muted. So Omar, I don't know if you can hear us. If you could unmute yourself, please, or okay, I think I'll just read out his question then. He was asking what's the best strategy to check if the reported preferences are accurate in line with actual preferences. So Farah or Mohammed, whoever.
I mean, I could start. I mean, it's very hard to know what the actual preferences are. And one thing you can do is you can, one of the negatives of a very sophisticated method is that it can be quite hard for people to understand. If it goes well, then you can do some sophisticated analysis in terms of risk preference estimation. So if people are going to struggle to understand, that it may argue in favor of a simpler measure. However, the more complicated measures do actually allow you to pick up lack of understanding. So the MPL method that Farah mentioned, when it's mentioned in terms of risk preferences or time preferences, you generally see one point at which people switch from near frame to far frame, or from a risky investment option to safe investment option. And it's very hard to rationalize with standard preferences why somebody would switch back. And so, as a researcher, you may be fearful of a measure that allows people to switch back, but in a way that does allow you some sort of check to see whether there's a lack of understanding. And you could choose to drop that data if people do not understand, or you could choose to, there are other methods that you could use. So it's really hard to know what the true preferences are, but you can put in place things that are very hard to rationalize. And one of these things is what's known as multiple switching and multiple price list.
Yeah, so I think Mohammed has answered all, the question very well. I'll just add that there have been studies where people are not sure if people would have understood, I mean, just hypothetically speaking, or through pilots. And so they do some kind of real incentivization. So, well, the MPL can be complex, but survey measures might not be real, as you're pointing out. People might not be paying attention, but we can maybe force them into a decision where they don't know that this is just an experiment, right? So an example of this is 2006 paper by Nawaz, where it's more or less you're selecting between actual savings account or it's an actual decision you're making. So there's no reason for you to not take this seriously. And so it's more of a real incentive. There's a lot of judgment that will come here. As a researcher, I think when you start practicing this or when you start piloting this, I think that will become quite clear to you that people are maybe not buying into this, maybe they're just playing around. If this is just happening on the tail of it, so there are a couple of people who are switching back and forth, you can afford to drop them because you're not sure if they're paying attention. But if this is happening because you think this is a cultural thing, people just don't want to make this decision. Just to give you an example, when we did risk preferences in a certain part of Pakistan, we found out that the coin toss was just, people were just then saying, this is gambling, we don't want to do this, etc. And that worked in one context, didn't work in that context. But it was immediately clear to us that this is what is happening. So you'll have to use some of your local knowledge also to understand that this might not be something that works. And then you can think of interesting ways of using the same strategy, but maybe involve more real incentives.
And just to add to Farah's point, when you're speaking to participants, you'll understand whether they're finding the question too abstract, maybe. And so if you're using a survey-based measure and it seems like a very abstract notion to them, what's risk? Then you can feel free to tweak the measure to make it more understandable to the particular participant that you're working with. If we're interested, if I'm working on micro enterprises, I'm really interested in investments that people are making in their business, right? And so I have to choose the optimal question that can allow me to understand a little bit about the way that they view risk in terms of their business. So, there's nothing to stop a researcher taking a question and adapting it to their particular context. These are not set in stone. And, as I think Farah indicated, the most important thing is that you have good data rather than needing to follow one specific format for a question.
Great, thank you both. We have a lot of questions coming in, so thank you so much to all the participants. We're going to unmute Savarana Pandey next. If you could ask your question live. Savarna, can you hear us? Hello, I think you're unmuted.
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for this nice presentation to kind of just give me an overview. So basically, I am going to be using common consequence ladders for my work in which I plan to pilot in Uganda whenever COVID allows me to. So I just wanted to get an opinion on like where would common consequence ladders of Gonzalez and Wu would kind of be placed in this like neat categorizations that Mohammed has done.
I have to be honest and admit, as I said before, I'm not the expert on this. I'm not familiar with the common consequences ladders. I'm not sure if Farah or Mahreen are. I'm not actually familiar with this method. Sounds fun.
No, I think it has some. Again, I'm not an expert on this either. I haven't personally used it, but I have a feeling it has some strict assumptions that people tend to stay away from. So I mean, you might want to think along those terms. Again, this is not coming from knowledge. This is just coming from what I know of it. Is basically when you start writing this up and you have to defend your answers, people might question the assumptions underlying this model. And my feeling is that it's something that has not, you know, has not dealt with critique well. So you might want to look into that.
Something that I just thought of is related a little bit to our previous conversation about multiple switches and what to do about them. You know, there are some people who force people not to make a multiple switch because they would rather not have that kind of data. So you're forcing monotonicity essentially. And while that may be appealing because you get clean data, you may start introducing noise into your estimates, and your estimates could be biased by forcing people. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not familiar with this particular method, but yeah, as Farah said, the assumptions that you're making are very important, especially later. And yeah, it's good to think of, rather than, you know, it's good to have a toolbox of a few possible methods that you're going to use. And to go back to the earlier point that Farah made about the importance of piloting, I would pilot a few methods rather than being fixed on one particular method. And be ready to adapt and switch to a method that may not be your originally preferred method if you think that's actually the most effective method to understand your participants.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Vatana Roth. We've unmuted you. I believe who's joining us from Cambodia. If you can ask your question, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay. First of all, thank you, the organizer, and also thank you, the presenter. I'm here in Cambodia, and we are planning to do a research on COVID-19 and focusing on investment of small and medium enterprises post COVID-19. So basically 2021, and trying to understand what are some of the policies that can actually encourage them to invest after this pandemic. And we are thinking between doing face-to-face survey-based and phone survey. And the restriction here is not as strict as in other country when it comes to lockdown, but we are thinking about adapting phone survey. In that case, as Muhammad mentioned, usually when it comes to doing a risk preference or time preference, I think the question are quite kind of like complicated, and the term itself sometimes can be confusing or not clear to the respondent. So if I'm about to adapt phone survey, what is your recommendation on the technique per se? Thank you.
Should I quickly?
Farah, go ahead.
So one thing that we've attempted in some of the COVID surveys we've done is we've used these validated measures that I mentioned earlier by Falk et al. They have both risk and time. And so they have the MPL, but they also ask subjectively, how much would you agree with the statement on that I'm more likely to accept something right now rather than in the future? And so you answer on a rank. And so that is something that you can do easily on the phone. They have both risk and time preference questions in a similar manner.
Yeah, similar advice from me, I think. Of course, this will vary for different people, but I personally, if I was doing a phone survey now, and the idea is you're interested in investment of micro enterprises, risk may be some interesting component of that, but it's not the primary point of the study. I wouldn't do MPL in this particular context, because how long do you have with people? Like 20, 30 minutes, right? MPL requires a series of questions, and there could be problems. You may have to go back. So I would do something along the lines of what Farah has suggested, which is to use some of the methods that Falk et al. have used, maybe some of the survey-based measures, or the question that I mentioned about single portfolio question. It's one question, and you could spend a little bit of time explaining the question and framing it in real terms, right? Safe investment versus risky investment. So yeah, I'd avoid multiple price lists, personally speaking, but that's not to say that they can't work in some contexts, but that's my own personal view.
I think especially without visually being able to show it to them, it's going to be very hard, unless you have very literate population who can go through practice rounds on tablets or smartphones. I think if you're relying on over the phone entirely, then it's going to be very hard. I could imagine a situation where you can send it to their phones and they get a link and then they're able to visually see it, but that's not going to be possible unless it's a very select sample within a low and middle income country.
Yeah, and the question becomes like, do you need to go to that much hassle for this particular element of preferences?
Absolutely, yeah.
Add one last point. It also depends on who you want to be answering. So the longer you ask one particular question, chances are they're going to start asking their family members. I mean, on the phone, you don't know who else is there. And so if you ask a complicated MPL, that person answering might say, I'm getting confused. Do you know what I should say here? And then you might be measuring something else. So short surveys, short, quick questions where they don't have a lot of time for discussion but understandable are good.
Great. I believe there was a question from Hyacinth, which I can't see now. Oh, he's been unmuted. Hyacinth Dede is joining actually from IFPRI's Nigeria office. So if you can ask your question, please. Are you able to ask your question? Yeah, I think.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
All right. Yeah. First of all, I want to thank the organizers and presenters of this activity. Yeah, my question is based on some bias that could come as a result of responses. I'm just like asking if do we envisage bias from respondents in relating to their response acting in a way? And from what you have done in the past, there are strategies to which you can use handle such bias. Sometimes in 2016, I participated in data collection, a survey, and it more like preference questions. And then we saw rural households just giving responses. I would say they just want to play around and tell you, yes, we'll do this. But behind them, they know that, yes, that doesn't represent, what they are saying doesn't actually represent what the actions will be in real life situation. So for me, there's a bias if we do not take care of that. So what do you have you had such experience, and what strategies did you employ to really deal with such? Thank you.
So I think it's a good point. There definitely could be a bias when it comes to risk preferences. I think, if you read some of the literature, there is a risk that when people self-report their level of risk tolerance, they self-report that there's a risk that they self-report that they're much more risk tolerant than they actually are, or that they would be if faced with a real investment decision. And so there is that risk of a bias. And so it comes back to the point about piloting. You could potentially pilot different measures and see if there's a decent correlation between those things. As I said, that many studies do find a good correlation between survey and non-survey measured, but it's not perfect, and there definitely could be a bias there. I think to be aware what's the potential direction of the bias and source of the bias in your particular study is quite important, I think.
Yeah, I think Mohammed has answered that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the question. Aisha Sophia is next, who I believe is based at IPA Kenya. We're unmuting you. If you could please ask your question, please, live.
Samir here. I suggest we just ask it for her.
Okay. So Aisha wants to know, how do you conduct a practice run in such a way that you do not lead the participants in thinking a certain way? What do you do if participants do not understand during the practice run? I think that's a really, useful question to think about, that how do you design it such that you don't start preempting the questions that you're going to be asking later and those responses?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be careful with the language. I've done work in Pakistan, and I don't speak Urdu. And so I remember when we were translating some of these questions on risk preferences and time preferences, I just recognized the Arabic terms that were being used for risk and time preferences. So one of the RAs, the term that they had used for risk sounded like danger in Arabic. And one of the ones that they used for time preferences sounded like patience, right? So danger definitely is usually a bad thing, right? Nobody would say that they like danger. And patience is then generally like a virtue, right? It's like a good thing. Nobody wants to say that few people want to say that they're not a patient person, right? So I think it's important that we don't use wording or frame it in a way such that people feel that they should say that they are averse to danger, or that they are a patient person and therefore they can wait, right? So the language is very important, and translating it well, piloting it and back translating, I think that's very important.
Great. Yeah, sorry, Farah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was actually going to go to the next question and flag that we don't have a lot of time left and a lot of questions, but do add if you have something on the practice round point. I think Farah is lagging a bit. We're going to go to Elena Naduka next, who is joining us from the University of Nigeria. And I think this might be the last live question. And because of time reasons, I'll start reading out some of the other questions so that we can get through them. So Elena Naduka, can you please ask your question?
Thank you very much for organizing this webinar. I'm actually listening from University of Exeter, where I'm doing my PhD. So actually my PhD has to do with energy and environment. So I apply contingent valuation and choice experiments. So I'm not conversant with time preference for money, but my question is, in a society where people do not generally trust others, so how do you instill trust in your participants that they will actually receive the amount if they prefer the feature option? Because I actually incorporated it in one of my surveys, because we wanted to incentivize participants, and we asked them if they would like to receive a higher amount in the future, and 100% of the participants said they preferred the immediate smaller amount. So how do you make sure in a society where there is no trust that what you are actually doing is the right thing, and the responses people are giving are the exact responses they would have given in a different situation?
I think, I don't know if it's Farah.
That's an excellent question. I think trust is an important, sorry, I don't have video on, I think. If you can hear me, let me know, I'm not sure.
We can hear you, Farah, fine.
Yeah, I can hear you.
on this, some of the things that you might want to do is, so we've noticed that working with a NGO, a lot of times we are working with an NGO. We don't want people from the NGO to be present. We don't want them to influence the others, but having them know that the NGO trusts us, and so we're working with them sometimes help with that trust level. You might not be working with the NGO, but you might be working with a survey firm that's trusted. That also helps. And then in addition, if you, so I don't know if Mahreen can share the slide again. So there was a slide there where we were giving vouchers. Well, this is again by Rachel Cassidy. She was giving vouchers where it stated specifically that you can almost like a contract, people signing, we're going to come back and pay you this much money later. That helps. Sometimes, yeah, so this one. So sometimes at the end of our survey, we like to pay our survey participant fee. So even if it's something, the time preference elicitation is going to involve payment later, but let's suppose at the end of the day, you're saying, you know, once you participate with us, we'll pay you $1 for participation. So that immediately is something that they can trust because they can see that money coming in. And that makes things easier for them to believe for sometimes in the future. But yes, trust is an important thing to establish. You don't want that to be the reason why people are taking the most immediate amount of money, because I think that you will disappear after a couple of months. The other thing is, I just want to come back to the front delay point that I briefly mentioned when I was presenting this, is that the front delay is that none of the options involve money today, right? So you're paying money either tomorrow or the day after. So in that sense, the level of trust is going to impact their decision making in the same way. So it's not as if it's going to very differently impact decision in the sense that are always accept option today because that's the thing that they can trust the most. So front delay helps a bit. If there's going to be mistrust, it's evenly distributed more or less. And the other thing is, and I would say, try to find collaborators who can vouch for you or use these kind of visual aids where they know it's like a contract for payment, that they know that you're going to come back and give this to us at that time.
Great, thank you. We have a lot more questions coming in than we have time left. So I'm going to ask one or two more myself without going through the process of unmuting them. And then we will request the panelists and as well as our team can promise to actually get back to you about these questions. So we can send you brief questions via email if that's all right. Eric Oching had a question about you having any experience where participants viewed the risk questions to be more like gambling, and so not wanting to participate in the risk preferences questions?
I haven't. So no one loses any money from any of these activities. You can't lose any money. People come to the, I mean, if you are, you can choose not to do incentivization, right? You can just do survey-based, hypothetical questions. Even when you're doing questions about investments, you can make it all hypothetical, right? You don't need to pay anything. But even those people who do incentivized activities, no one can ever walk away losing any money. Like no one can ever lose any money. They either make some or make less. They pay the participation fee, etc. Right? So, to my understanding, no one would ever allow anyone to take money from a participant.
Okay. Great, thank you. Then Gwen Jairo Tokat, sorry if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name, wants to know if there is any measure to try to estimate the uncertainty risk of the real world around participants. So I'm wondering if they're thinking about domain-specific risk. Yeah. I think we have talked mostly about time and risk related to money so far. There may be other domains, especially with time, where you can think about effort. So maybe we can say a little about that now.
Yeah, I think that's, you've said it yourself, Mahreen. I think that's exactly why people started doing these domain ones, because so they were surveying people who maybe were professional financial traders, right? And they had specific way that they dealt with risk in terms of the investments that they dealt in their business or in their work in the day-to-day activities. But when you looked at the way that they dealt with health risks in their life or sports risks, they were completely different type of behavior, right? So that's why you have these very detailed domain-specific risk questions, because it's natural that we have different domains in which we operate, and we have different risks that we take in different domains, right? I may take risks with my health and not with my business, maybe the other way around. So that's why these are very good questions, the domain-specific risk preference questions. Definitely, I'd look into them and choose ones that are appropriate to your context.
Thank you. So Lucas has a question on calibrating the amounts used in the questions when piloting, and what are your criteria to judge whether a measure works well?
Yeah, I mean, there are probably many behavioral experimental economists who would say just like pay as much as you can if you can. Of course, you know, people who do incentivize, they wouldn't typically pay for each activity. They would randomly draw from those. You know, clearly, if you're paying something that's trivially small relative to their daily income or weekly income, then it has a little bit less of an impact in terms of the incentivization. It's criteria to judge whether a measure works well. As I said, with the multiple price list, risk preference elicitation, multiple switches are your biggest, one of your biggest indications of a lack of understanding, right? So the number of multiple switches that you have in your data is clearly a measure of whether it's gone well with particular participants. And another one is variation, right? If everyone's choosing out of a list of 6 rows in the Binswanger thing, if everyone's choosing number 3, you have no variation. And if one of the objectives of your risk preference elicitation measure was understanding the heterogeneity and risk preferences amongst a particular sample, if you're getting no variation in your measure, then it's not really fulfilling the purpose. Just a quick point, people use some of these activities to estimate like a risk preference parameter. And these have found to be very context specific and not very good in terms of like out of sample prediction. And so that's just one thing to be wary of if you are going to estimate parameters. But yeah, if you have no variation, then you're not really able to talk about heterogeneity within your own sample.
Alison Mahmud has a question about loss aversion. I know we haven't talked about it, but if I can call on you, Mohammed, I know you have some experience thinking about it. Like, she wants to know if nobody can walk away with a net loss, how do you test for loss aversion?
Well, what some people haven't done much or anything really on loss aversion. Haven't done much. What they would do is pay people a participation fee, and then it can come out of the participation fee. So you basically have less of a participation fee. So you, like, to my understanding, you cannot take, no ethics review committee would ever allow you, and you'd never want to take money away from people, but you can pay someone a participation fee and then reduce that participation fee, if you see what I mean.
Yes, I think that has been my experience as well, that will not go through any ethics review. So you will have to pay them an X amount and then take away. So that has been practically what has been done to measure loss aversion. But it can still, I think it has still worked fairly well in giving you a sense of if people are weighting losses and gains differently. I'm conscious of time. Maybe we can take a final few questions. Somebody had asked like a more broader question about best resources for academic materials to look for understanding and measuring these. I imagine most of these will be some of the seminal papers, or if you have any other resources in mind.
Mahreen, could you, there's a blog post on the risk preference elicitation. I don't know if you can share that with participants or in the chat or something. I've put some of the literature reviews of risk preference elicitation. I think Farah mentioned some.
Absolutely. So I think this was the Measurement Matters post that I mentioned at the start. Some of you might not have joined us then. We will try to post this link to you via email at the end as well. So this is a Measurement Matters series that the Mind and Behaviour Research Group does. And Mohammed wrote a post on it for risk preferences, which is what the question was particularly about actually, which you can refer to for some of the literature on this. But on time, if there's anything Farah you'd like to point to.
Fortunately, we have a new review in Journal of Economic Literature, and it's basically discussing which methods are used most frequently, what are the advantages, disadvantages, and how people are now dealing with some of the effort tasks to deal with some issues with the MPL as well. So I would encourage you to also look at that. It's by Cohen et al. And then the Handbook of Behavioral Economics, which came out, I believe, last year, it has some good examples. So some good practical examples of just alerting you to the fact that you might not always, what things you should be familiar with when you elicit something, what are some of the things you should be warned about. So they have examples, and this new literature review is just basically a good summary of what has been found in time preferences.
Great, thank you so much, both Farah and Mohammed. I think it's time, we're all just on time, so we will wrap up. I would like to mention here that we will be holding this, as I said at the start, this webinar series throughout the month of September. I think you should be able to see the next one, which will be next week on Thursday. Please note the slightly earlier start time because we have a speaker joining us from Australia. So to accommodate her, only this webinar is starting 1.5 hours earlier. This will be on measurement of expectations and beliefs. Lucas Hensel will be moderating, and we'll have Adeline Delavend and John Mungai talking about both, again, the same format as today. The link for registration is being displayed. You can also follow CSA Twitter, where we will be posting this briefly. Shortly. Also note, a lot of you have been asking that this session was recorded and will be posted on the CSA's YouTube channel, and we will also be tweeting about it as soon as it is up, likely early tomorrow morning, and it will also be posted on the Mind Behaviour Research Group website. So I think the final thing I wanted to mention is that we will be sending you a feedback form. We would be really thankful if you could let us know what worked, what didn't, what topics you would like to hear about in the future, because ultimately, the whole point of this webinar series is so that we can all benefit from the knowledge of each other and not have to reinvent the wheel every time we are going and implementing these techniques in low and middle income countries. So thank you so much, Mohammed and Mahreen and Farah, and I hope all of you found this session useful.